Joe, you grew up on a farm.
No, but it's in the DNA.
I see. So how do we feel about the word homesteader?
Like instead of farmer?
Yeah, like homesteader instead of farmer.
Insteader.
Insteader. From Webisodes, this is Growability, a podcast at the intersection of urban agriculture, food security, and community.
On this episode, I speak with urban homesteader and university professor, Dr. Mike Courey.
Mike runs the new Moon Community Homestead within the Rose Land Care Association, a nonprofit dedicated to sustainable agriculture and land stewardship. When does this guy sleep?
I know, right? And between his academic work in the city and working on the farm, he's got a truly unique point of view when it comes to bridging urban and rural communities.
Plus, the way he approaches community ownership and sustainable practices is so refreshing. I think if us city folks really understood food production, it would lead to better food policy and access to healthy foods.
Absolutely, and he's kind of open sourced it so that the ideas can be portable to other communities across North America and around the world.
Totally. And if you, dear audience member, have global ambitions or even just questions, suggestions, ideas for our future episodes, send them to joe@growabilitypod.com.
This interview was recorded at Siskins, the law firm. Thanks to them for making the time and beautiful space available.
And now, here's the battle of the beards we've all been waiting for, Joe's interview with Dr. Mike Courey.
Michael, thank you for being here. You bring so much to talk about that the Growability audience deeply cares about.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
The audience will hear your bio in the intro. We'll record it separately, but honestly, where do we even start with you? What does a day in your life look like?
All right. So, yes, we're running a farm called New Moon Community Homestead. And on that farm, in terms of agriculture, there's food processing, there's community development, et cetera. But in terms of agriculture, what we're doing there is we're growing 5 acres of vegetables and also raising for meat, pigs, chicken, and cows, and also eggs. So the average day on the farm, right now we're coming to the end of the main season of the year in which we're growing the vegetables, animals, etc. And so usually first thing in the morning is get up, make sure all the animals are open and out, and take a walk through the gardens, see if there's any major issues we got to deal with for that day. And then usually then our team starts coming in around 8:00, 8:30. And so my job is to make sure we have our sort of workflow for the day ready. And, whether that's harvesting, planting, a new small building project, or whatever it is, sort of get the game plan together for the day, and coordinate the team. And then from there, we get our hands dirty in whatever the main thing for the day is. And it's true, like really between like April and October, really it's just whatever's the most urgent. Right. So we're not really working on our long-term bigger projects that comes after the season in the kind of off season usually. And we're just dealing with whatever's most urgent that week, whether that be harvesting, whether that be dealing with an animal issue we're having, or getting to markets or running events. All those things come up.
Now you're an agricultural renaissance man, and there's another component to you, and that is your very robust academic career. Mm-hmm. How do all those things come together for you?
Well, I've always been, I have spent the last 15 to 20 years in academia, and I have quite a journey through that, right from a diploma in agriculture into undergraduates in sociology and business administration, and then really graduate school off into sociology, community development, economic development, that world. And it all comes together because through the academic journey, one of the observations would be it's hard to be an academic in the sense of we're continuously asking questions. We're continuously trying to provide answers. But sometimes it doesn't come with the practice. And so in my journey, I took a lot of time to put the thoughts, the theories, the assumptions that I'm taking in my sociology into action. And so I always did some community development side as well as the academia, research, writing side of things. And so this kind of all comes together in this stage of my life, coming to a point where an opportunity arose to get into farming, really as a platform for social change around food, economy, etc. And this opportunity came up to really put things into practice and learn things from the ground up. And so that's really how I see it in my life, is taking a lot of the idea work that I've done and bringing it into practice. And I really do think it's all going to boomerang back into re-theorizing and re-academicizing.
Well, you've definitely put into practice. You've put into practice with your initiative, New Moon Community Homestead, through the Rose Land Care Association. Could you tell us about those two entities?
All right, so the farm that we're on is in Elsa Craig, and it's a 200-acre farm, mixed. You have your sort of cropping fields, about 115 acres. You've got a river, the Ausable River, that runs through, and about 50 acres of bush. Just a beautiful, beautiful landscape in southern Ontario, really. And this farm was purchased in 1991 by Rose Land Care Association. This was a group of Londoners who came together, who wanted to make contributions into sustainable agriculture, land holding, and sort of land stewardship, how to protect land for future generations. And in 1991, a group of Londoners came together with a couple who was actually on a journey from Germany.
Wow.
Who wanted to push forward this model of agriculture and community development, Alex and Eleanor Nurnberg.
Okay.
And they were able to gather the funds to purchase this property and formed Rose Land Care Association to hold the land in trust in perpetuity for future generations. And sustainable agriculture. We'll get into biodynamic agriculture. And so Rose Land Care established as a nonprofit of holding this farm. And from then on, there was the farming family was Alex and Eleanor Nurnberg, who through a variation of a tenant-landlord relationship, but really a joint partnership in stewarding this farm, farmed that farm for about 25 years. And as many farms have, there's challenges in succession when it comes to retirement. And so Alex and Eleanor came into the retirement phase of their farming journey. And, there was some search for like, how's this farm going to live on with the mission that is intended for? And that search, went over about a 5-year period. And eventually our family was just in the right spot to be transitioning our own work. And this opportunity came up and we landed there. And so, the mission of Rose Land Care Association is really what brought us to this farm. The mission of protecting land, of taking it off the market for speculation, of using this type of model to bring new types of farming into the future and new food systems. And also, of course, the organic, regenerative, biodynamic approach to land stewardship, water stewardship, air, showing that we can be sustainable, we can sustainably farm and protect those things.
Right.
So all of that spoke to us as a family, really at our core, and in the background of what I was doing academically around, just social, economic, environmental justice issues. And so it came forward and we had to develop a model then. Well, what do we do? So there's this farm in transition. There's a beautiful nonprofit that's been holding this and is holding it in perpetuity for future generations. What kind of enterprise makes sense in this work? And so we developed New Moon Community Homestead as a social enterprise to basically bring the mission of the nonprofit into our work as a farming group.
Right.
And so that's sort of where we came from.
200 acres is a lot of land.
Mm-hmm.
Does New Moon farm all of that land currently?
So currently we're farming about 30 acres of that farm. Okay. And in February, early in 2025, we'll be farming the rest of that farm.
Right.
That's about 115 tillable acres. And we just actually, through, again, a lot of work with the Rose Land Care Association, thinking about what's an appropriate model that both serves the needs of the community, of the land, and of individuals and families. What kind of agreements do we have to have in place? And so we just signed near the end of, earlier this year, a 20-year agreement that really does build in stability for the farming group and a good runway and mutual benefits for both the Land Care Association and the enterprise. And so that's where we're headed, is expanding onto the whole farm. Yeah.
So moving on to such a unique farming model, were there requirements that were there expectations that you had to meet?
So, well, I think the number one expectation is the mission alignment. So, of course, as a nonprofit, a community entity for community purpose, well, the mission is really the purpose of existing.
Right.
And so we had to be the kinds of people who fully valued that mission, who had it hopefully demonstrated it in our own history, in our own personal development, in our own engagement in community, and positioned us in a way that made sense. That, the mission of the organization, again, to review those, promoting the social and therapeutic aspects of agriculture, holding this land in trust and stewarding it for future generations, creating urban and rural connections, like really bringing together the farming experience and the urban experience, and then promoting and pushing for biodynamic agriculture. That those would be pieces of our own personality and our own lives that are authentic. And so I think that's really what brought it together, was the mission alignment was the first thing. And then from there is, well, what are you going to do? How are you going to do this? Because agriculture these days is not a very accessible industry, you might say, or building enterprises that actually make sense is really difficult in agriculture of this size. And so then, in addition to having the value alignment, then it was about, well, the skill set, what kind of business development, knowledge, experience we would have, what kind of agricultural experience. And in those areas, again, through our own family and personal development, those were always pieces that we've been developing over the last 20 years. My mother's side of the family are farmers for about 5 generations in Quebec. So I had a good entry into farming by growing up, working with on that family farm, for months at a time throughout my childhood and youth and into my young adulthood. Worked on a few other farms in Southern Ontario in my young adulthood. Right. And so that experience itself, and then brought in, to my later adult work, like into my late 20s and 30s, which was really about social and economic justice in an urban environment, and different ways of treating capital and employment and et cetera. And it all kind of merges together into, I think, what was a attractive skill set, both for Rose. They saw, okay, here's a family and some people who can hopefully lift this thing into the next stage. And for us, just seeing that this place even existed in Southern Ontario, that when we heard and learned about Rose Land Care Association, Sunnyview Farm, that this was even here for 25 years before, and we didn't know much about it. It just felt like fate, like alignment in who we are, who I am, what we care about as a family, and the existence of this land. So in a way, just that alignment is just wonderful.
Let's go back a little bit. Biodynamic farming, for folks that are viewing this and listening to this, there may be some questions about that. What is biodynamic farming?
So biodynamic farming is an approach to agriculture and stewardship that founded by a philosopher, Rudolf Steiner, going back to the early 20th century. And really, in my mind, Rudolf Steiner and biodynamics was really an early exploration and statement of organic farming, saying, whoa, we got to stop treating land only as like a commodity and something that we can extract from only,
Right.
but we have to start thinking about land as a living entity. We have to start nurturing the living energies of soil and be aware of all the various pieces of that. And so biodynamic agriculture, I think, starts from that point. And then Rudolf Steiner then, develops a whole set of practices that can go along. Some of the more popular aspects of biodynamics are various preparations and sprays, like natural sprays that are put onto fields and into soil. At different times of year, those are called preparations. And so that's one component. But really, that's one component that we're developing a little bit on the farm. But really, the part that I really think I take out of biodynamics that I think is super important is the attention to the personal and spiritual connection of the farmer and the responsibility of the farmer to the beings of the land. And so in biodynamics and Steiner type of philosophy is a lot of personal, spiritual, and development that's required, and a consciousness. Of course, is never perfect, but is always cultivated, and understanding how that's related to then the care of spaces and places and soils. And of course, as agriculture is not only it's caring for all those beings, but it's also caring them in the community. You're providing foods, and in fact, some of the earlier parts of, so he has a series of lectures called the agricultural lectures, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry. And early on in that,
it's a good read.
It's a good read. It's a good read. Some of it's pretty thick and some of it's pretty direct. But one of the, very fascinating philosophical aspects to think through that they start off with is like the notion of like the foods that we are consuming actually may reflect and be more important than we think in terms of our human and spiritual development over time. And, I really do think about that a lot in terms of the kinds of extractions that we do in our society, the kinds of consumptionisms that occur, and really in some ways, like as a mass analysis, as the unconsciousness in our society around destroying things and not regenerating them gets reflected in that food. And then we kind of are also feeling and seeing a kind of social breakdown or a social malaise. And you're like, well, maybe there's something to this, that like as we are intentional and sensitive and caring about the thing that sustains us, food, air, water, that mind, like that focusing or meditating on those, that the goodness of those things may actually be really important for the personal development. And of course, that is then reflected in the social development of our communities. Right. And I'll just say one more thing about that is that the, like a lot of things like biodynamics, there's communities of practice, and they do differ between those different communities.
Of course.
And so I'm not very dogmatic about those things. It's really, if there's anything about Steiner's philosophies that I think are really helpful, it's the importance of the trusting our own intuitions, but developing those intuitions about how we're going to approach the world. And that's a big contrast to a dogmatic approach to anything.
Yes. That
we should avoid dogmatism and be open to learning, development, sharing, etc.
Right.
So
connection, it's a key to sustainability.
Yeah.
And speaking about connection, you have been heavily involved in the London Poverty Research Council.
Mm-hmm. Research Center,
Research Center. How did that come to be?
Yeah, my work just before, in 2021, we moved to this farm and established New Moon Community Homestead. And just prior to that, my work in the city of London, or in the city of London, was directing the London Poverty Research Center at King's. So that was a research center that was established back in like 2015, 16,
Okay.
when London went through a led by the City of London project around poverty reduction initiatives,
Okay.
trying to convene various sectors of the city to address how are we going to deal with, poverty in London. Why is our childhood poverty in London one of the highest in the country, et cetera. And so out of that initiative from the City of London and various organizations came the London Poverty Research Center, which was a collaboration really between King's University College, Sisters of St. Joseph, and the London Food Bank.
Okay.
To, again, bring that connection between real world issues and academic knowledge and mobilizing in a community. How do we do all that? And so in the work at the London Poverty Research Center, which I was pretty excited about, like on the one hand, we were, doing the bean counting work of just like, well, how much poverty is there and where is it? And that sort of descriptive work. But then what was exciting about that work was it was also about what are we going to do here? Like, what can we do? How are we going to mobilize inside of London to address the issues of poverty, both seen and unseen poverty, and even a sensitivity to like, okay, well, obviously like issues of poverty are there's local activities and local issues we can address, and there's also provincial, national, international trends that are affecting it. What are you really going to do about it all, right? But really, what I thought the London Poverty Research Center was really great for was that there was a big commitment to figuring out how do we change the system, what role can we play in changing systems to really get to some root issues that create poverty. So at the Poverty Research Center, my last 2 years there or 3 years there was actually focused on economic development, on like how do you restructure local economies to address issues of poverty and precarity. And so that work came from a national trend and across various universities studying precarious employment. Like it was like, oh geez, so yes, we see a lot of poverty out there on the street. We see, in terms of mental health and addictions, but there's a lot of invisible poverty also happening that's sort of being generated by our economic structure.
Right.
Like households who are food insecure, who are also working, who are also accessing the food banks or whatever. And you're saying, well, how are they working? What's this working poor situation also? Obviously that has something to do with how our economy rewards work. And so that really brought in a project that was called Inclusive Economy London and Region. Yes. And it was about looking at just ways of building more economic resiliency, rewarding business and industry that actually supports their workers and creates stability in the workforce, as opposed to precarity, as opposed to, low wage, unpredictability in their work, et cetera. And one of the interesting tools that came out of that work, again, that leads me back into this farming work, was a big theme around community ownership. Well, so, in this economy, with too much centralized or privatized ownership, it can be very extractive. And so, in some way, a precarious workforce is actually in the interest of capital accumulation. The less we pay, obviously, the more we can keep. It's kind of, and I know it gets more complicated than that, but, and anyway, so in this kind of problem came this notion of, well, community and worker ownership, that maybe, when things are community owned and have the interest of the community in their mission statement, and they can still be enterprises who are productive, right? That community owned enterprises should and would create a more equitable economy. And so so we worked a little bit in that area of community ownership, nonprofit ownership of enterprises, social enterprise. And I really think there's something there in terms of the future. Right. And So then you fast forward a little bit, end up on a farm
Yeah.
that's already protected by a nonprofit, that's already community owned in that regard, that's already has a mission embedded in it. And okay, so now what does an enterprise look like that's actually going to be hopefully equitable and inclusive and all of that? But, just briefly, once we get to the practice again, so you're developing a social enterprise in this way, in a field like food production and agriculture, it's really hard.
Well, and there's a lot there, and developing or researching where there's disconnections, coming to conclusions, and then developing connections, and then going from academia to organizational development. There's a lot there.
There's a lot.
So there was a lot where you came from with, with your work with London Poverty Research to the farm. So can we talk about taking that experience and, with a community farm, there's a lot of organizational development. And how does that look not being in a big center, being in a rural area?
Yeah. So moving out to the farm and positioning to get started on a project like Moon Community Homestead, the work we did in the city beforehand was actually extremely valuable.
Right,
Even in that, like, wonderful relationships built in many different organizations in the city already. A great community of people. Like, we were really involved in Old East Village, back, all the way back to like 2009. And it's kind of exciting, community economic development during a bunch of those years, and organizing things like again with that, my real strong commitment to like academia and practice and doing things. Really got some good experience in like coordinating people, coordinating events, coordinating budgeting things, finding grants, writing grants, administering grants. All of that comes to life also in the farm world, and on this farm. And so I can get into describing some of those relationships, or
Sure.
maybe so several relationships are really anchored us on that farm with organizations in London. So one of those, and they align with values, so we can go over
course.
that. Like, so on the one hand, from a food security point of view, because, again, we're really sensitive to not just being a food producer for already well-off people. Like, I know, again, from a business point of view, sometimes the recommendation is, no, just look for your elite clients and keep those elite clients. They're going to pay what it's worth. So that's just what you should
Go
do.
where the money is.
Yeah, you kind of, and you know what? And truthfully, at the end of the day, in some regard, you might have to. Like, you might not survive. Is as a farm, as a small scale farm, these farms are dying by the day.
That's right.
So that's a serious issue. But there are ways you have to get really creative about how to deal with that reality, and then the realities of food insecurity, and wanting to ensure that you have accessible organic foods for people. And anyway, so some of the ways that we do that, like some of the low-hanging ways that came up early, one is the London Food Coalition.
Yes.
So, again, with the work in the poverty sector, and I did the stuff in the homelessness sector and things like that. So we just great relationships, and the London Food Coalition was in a stage where basically they had coolers in town,
Right.
mobile coolers on wheels, and these coolers were being vandalized on a very regular basis. There was a difficulty protecting them. There was issues going on, and we were moving to this farm, and through just conversation, it turned out, okay, well, you know what? If we could support the farm by lending you these coolers and letting you use them for food storage, which will allow you to grow and be prosperous food producers in the region, then we have a commitment to the Food Coalition to bring foods into the city, because at many farms, particularly in produce, you produce surpluses often, and we have neighboring farms then that we can also collect food from and bring into the city.
Yeah.
So really great relationships like that. And it's been super meaningful to allow a social enterprise to get established, as well as then helping us have our mission alignment for addressing food insecurity. So that's one of the ways.
Yep.
Another one is around issues of precarious or around employment, we'll say.
Yes.
And so I know, Joe, you're a Hutton House
I am.
representative, and our relationship with Hutton House has been extremely meaningful for the development of New Moon Community Homestead as a social enterprise. Because on the employment side, we want to provide opportunities for people to engage in meaningful work that's satisfying to their own personhood and also contributes to building a better future. And so through Hutton House, we've been able to hire several people, particularly in our seasonal work, to start being trained and being experience what food production, farming has been all about. And the alignment there, with Hutton House focusing it on urban agriculture, food production, and food security, this kind of organizational relationship then allows us to be part of that kind of movement as well.
Right.
And this is like hands down amazing. This allows us to fulfill our social enterprising mandates. And it's been super good. Like every placement that we've had coming through the farm has led to good things. So those are a couple of the organizational relationships that really have allowed us to start, establish, and be stronger, and hopefully has allowed us to be a good contributor back into community. Right?
Speaking of that, something that we talked a lot about many times is the urban and rural connection, and it's something that you mentioned that's part of the mandate.
Yeah.
What's the link? Why?
Why the urban and rural, eh? Well, I'd say at minimum, the foods that we're eating are largely coming still from rural environments.
Right.
And there's a lot, probably in both directions, that can be learned and shaped from mixing rural thinking, rural experience, rural life with urban, like with different views and perspectives on the world.
Right.
Now, from a food production, food security, food policy point of view, it seems to me extremely important. The more that we have open access to farms, that urban people can visit rural places and actually kind of see and feel an authentic farming experience, and learn about the challenges, learn about the strengths, etc., that we could then have a much more informed food policy environment. So this is as the urban environment becomes more detached from food production or farms, then it's harder to create good farming policy.
Yes.
Because one, who's going to support it? Is the information that's being used to support new policy actually accurate or relevant? Those kinds of things are really challenging. So I think that's a big part of the urban-rural connection. And then also, experiences of children who come onto farms. Like we do a lot of farm tours, sort of play days on the farm. We have a membership base of the farm specifically for families who can then integrate their lives, city lives, into farming life a little bit. And I think in child development, having that experience from a young age, seeing and feeling some of the great things and some of the really kind of not so nice things of farming and eating meat specifically, or dealing with animals, those are impressionable on young people's minds. And so I think it has a lot it could inform directions people choose to go in positive ways and things like that.
I think so. When I think of your work and the rural focus, and how the farm does welcome, urban community members, it comes back to the urban, and it sparks, thoughts around urban agriculture.
Mm-hmm.
And how do you see that urban agriculture spark working towards poverty alleviation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, urban agriculture has a huge potential, right? Like there's wonderful projects already in London. Urban Roots,
Right.
the Patch in the Cavendish Garden, even some in terms of the private sector enterprises around greenhouse growing or hydroponic growing over at the Western Fair, where you're probably seeing some significant food production in non-rural, kind of non-agricultural spaces in a way. And so the more that we can produce, obviously, the more that we can produce food, there's so many benefits of producing food in an urban environment,
Yes.
The environmental component of it, transportation, etc., the closeness of that experience. And so, you know what, growing vegetables, and vegetables can go a long way, and a small plot can go a long way into a household,
Yeah.
So in terms of food security, being inspired and supported to be able to grow foods, people can be that much more self-resilient, and households can be that better fed. Now, cracking the code on how to get there, I do think it's something, Cavendish Garden and Urban Roots are cracking a code of some kind of because it's really hard to put that whole responsibility onto already a family who's overly burdened.
Yes.
Who might be having a lot of various challenges inside the household. How are we going to start growing our own garden, right? So there's something to it there around community gardening, where organizations support neighborhoods to grow and start distributing, in a way, free food into the neighborhoods, addressing that food insecurity. There's such a promise there. Now, I think it's worth noting, can urban agriculture feed the entire city in a way, being able to both build community in the rural in terms of supporting food into the city, and build urban agricultural systems that are intentionally distributing food into low-income households. That there's a great mix there.
There is.
Yeah.
There's an environmental sustainability aspect to family farms, to community farms. What does that mean to you?
So the environmental sustainability, first, urban agriculture, that's a very strong sustainable component, is not have less transportation, right? Less needing fuel to move foods.
Yeah.
But again, when you go back to the rural, there's a whole other set of issues sort of stacking up. So where to start? I think, primarily, one of the largest is just chemicals going into the soil,
right,
and into the water. When we see our soy and bean fields that are really surrounding our city, much more than something like vegetables or fruit production. There's questions to ask about what's going into those fields. Where are those pesticides going to? Are they going into the food? Are they going into the soil? Are they going into the water?
Yeah.
That's a huge issue. And small scale farms can have a lot to contribute to that. In terms of it's just a totally different mindset on how to approach land and food when you're thinking about directly feeding communities. So it's something that blows my mind. A few things that blow my mind. And as an urban-ish person,
right,
emerging into the rural community and thinking about all these things, the one thing that blows my mind, I don't see why we don't have more vegetable and fruit production.
Yes.
Is it incentivized? Is it not incentivized? What's the reason why we don't have more fruit and vegetable production right close to the city that's feeding right into the city? Because you can feed a lot of people off an acre.
Yes, you can.
We can go through a whole list of reasons maybe why that's not happening, but that's one question I have about perplexing things observing in the rural. And then the other part about the rural and food production that's standing out to me is where there's a lot of crops being grown out there.
Yes, there are.
Over a lot of huge pieces of land. I'm thinking, where's the animals? Like, where are the animal side of this? Because at least, again, in a biodynamic sense, and I think in a scientific sense, when you take things out of land, out of soil, you've got to put things back in. And so the biodynamic way of doing that is really focusing in on your animal manures, composting manures, and reapplication on the land that you've taken from. So this one blows my mind. Like, you're driving all the way, you got this area all the way up really into Windsor, Essex area, huge land and no animals. So I'm thinking, well, where are these nutrients coming from? How are we getting nutrients back in? And are these sustainable nutrients? So in a farm like New Moon Community Homestead, Rose Land Care Association, where we bring these principles, we're really trying to create a balance between nutrient extraction, nutrient input, all within a sort of a semi-closed system.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and that, I think that goes back to connection. It's something that we, that seems to come up a lot on the podcast. We're talking about connection, and we're talking about disconnection. But being driven towards connection. Let's be positive.
Yeah.
Is there a grand unification theory connecting poverty, inclusion, urban agriculture, and environmental stewardship?
No.
From Mike's mind.
So the connections across, addressing, this is kind of like, are there certain activities in the food agricultural sector that can address multiple social problems
that we can draw it all together, and we can champion things like urban agriculture, alleviate poverty, maybe.
So here's how I approach it, and because I got big dreams. I'm a big dreamer.
This is good. We need those.
We're gonna make the world a better place through what we're doing. We're gonna, from a very privileged person, great family, decent economic history. I'm gonna do what we sacrifice what we can to really make the world a better place. That's, at the same time, I temper that with what I do in the world isn't everything. There's a lot of important things to be done. And so when I think about the farming, the agriculture, food insecurity, environmental problems in there, the first thing I say is, what can we contribute to the solutions? Can we, we can be contributors,
right?
Rather than the solution maker. And so I wouldn't want to overreach, what we can do on a 200-acre farm in terms of changing the whole world. Yeah. But all that being said, no, I really think that this integration of community land ownership, so where you're bringing purpose to ownership, right? Yes. To ownership or holding, and really even then in the community of Rose Land Care Association, there's actually a resistance to the whole notion of ownership.
Yes,
that it's really land stewardship and holding and protecting. That's really what the title is for. You have the title to the land to protect the land, right? So that right there is radically transformative when you think about agriculture and farms. And then when you think about housing and urban property, that to me that's enough for me to jump right on this project and do it for the rest of my life.
Absolutely.
I'm so we're going to think about holding land differently, and who's allowed to, and how we're going to treat it, from an extraction to a stewardship mentality. That's
the land's part of the equation.
Let's just start there and promote that whole concept. And then mix that, community ownership and holding of land with then supporting food production and social enterprises. Oh, geez. Now we're into, you've got a double model going on. You've got a, hopefully something that will have to be funded in terms of holding land. And then you've got real enterprising, social enterprising that, it can get supports in various ways, but also will be fairly self-regenerative in terms of a successful business. So you've got now protected land, and you've got a mission-oriented business that is looking for economic sustainability,
Yes.
but also mission alignment and everything that's going on. And you're like, oh, now you've got something going on here, right? And of course, and so from our dream would be, holy geez, Rose Land Care Association has pushed forward a model of holding land for future generations. New Moon Community Homestead has developed an enterprise that slowly becomes ever more impactful in the food system and the region, and starts to grow that model, of course, into other farms. So being able to hold other farms, other land in this kind of way, and nurture and protect, because the truth is farmers and the ones doing the work need a lot of protection.
They do,
because it's a volatile food system. The trends in food production in the rural are not promising in terms of having new farmers join in, having organic and less having organic really practices expanding. Not very promising. We need to both. It's what feels kind of strange in the work we are, because we're kind of like, what are we? Are we a private business? Are we just lining someone's pockets? So when someone supports New Moon, is that just driving money into private ownership pockets, or what's going on, right? But really, when you get a good look at the food system, it's super aware. We need organizations who protect farmers.
yes,
Because we're going to lose all the farmers, and it's going to continue to massify. It's going to continue to be, the trend has been less farms, more land,
right.
and smaller margins. So then, a farmer is not going to make a living on 300 acres of corn and soy. Now you need 1,100 acres to make a living. Those aren't the specifics.
No, of course.
But that kind of massifying of agriculture, and that's just in soy and corn. Let alone you get into the real food that people are going to eat, right? And now we need processing facilities.
Yes.
We need to be able to new equipment. We need efficiencies in actually working the land in positive ways and harvesting, etc. It's like there's a whole lot of support that's not about profit making, that's needed to expand this community farming kind of way of doing things.
We need more of it.
We need more of it, and it needs to be protected.
Yeah.
Or needs protectors, I should say.
Yes. Let's talk about your approach to knowledge mobilization, community organization, and bringing about sustainable solutions to social and economic and environmental issues. A lot.
Yeah.
But these are all points that we've chatted about, and they've like the river that runs through the farm, they've run through your work.
Yeah.
How do you not only gather the knowledge but share the knowledge? As both an academic and somebody that has a lot of work that they primarily do hands on. How do you mobilize that knowledge?
Yeah. Well, I'll say to me, it's always a long game. It's always. Yeah. It takes some years to establish a farming practice, just the practice. Then you have the community development component, and then you've got the knowledge mobilization and sort of social movement component of it all. And so, first off, a lot of patience is required.
Of course,
years. We're talking years, right? Lifetimes. And not we can just jump into something and within 2 years have all these metrics that we hit. So that's really important, because we do get into the community of the farming at times.
right.
Folks, some sometimes people want to see results a lot faster, and farming is year by year. Like even what they say about a farmer is like, you got 30 chances in your life.
Okay.
You got 30 seasons.
Yeah.
You're going to make that season. So you got to learn from that season. Then you got to learn the next season. And so that itself is, that's not, is 30 a lot? It doesn't feel like a lot.
It doesn't feel like a lot.
It could be the 10th season
like
before you feel like, oh shoot,
yeah,
we forgot about this thing.
Yeah.
So anyway, there is a big, long game to it all. That's important. However, passion and commitment go a long way. So, and this is another, I'm sure in urban environments, you get similar platforms, but the farm becomes a platform is the truth. So yes, we got to work crazy hard to just be farmers, just to be growing stuff. Then we've got to work crazy hard to be making stuff out of the food. So food processing and figuring it out, economically viable models for doing it all. But really at the heart and soul of it, and I do think this is why it's been a good experience on the farm. Like people, we've experienced a lot of blessings, or like people arriving to the farm and gifting the farm good things.
Yes.
And I do think that's because, or partly because, it's what we want to achieve in the social, environmental, and economic sense, is apparent. And so the farm becomes a platform for those conversations, right? Whether that's when we have children coming on for day camps, or whether that's when we have a Hudson House group come out for tours and discussions about food, or whether that's when we have a group of students from Huron come and stay on the farm for a week and we talk about land trusts and food security, things like that, right? Or sustainable development goals, or there's so many avenues to be sharing experiences about farming and social, economic, environmental justice. So it's got to get built into the DNA of the farm team, like the folks who are working on the farm. That has to be also important in our culture of even talking to each other about these are the things that we're going to spend our times talking about on and off work, right? And thinking about and sharing about. And so it's a little, I guess that's part of the community that you can build. And it is true, a farm allows you to build a pretty fun community of diverse people. There's so many interests that you can have on a farm, right? I can enjoy fishing, or I can enjoy weeding, or you can enjoy bird watching. And, or I could just be super passionate about food security. Yeah. And so you can have all these different people coming together. And it's really important, I think, to keep that diversity. Going back to not being dogmatic, it's extremely important to keep diversity in farming, in communities. I'm talking about diversity in thinking, but also diversity in just like racial diversity. We're really enjoying in the rural, as in some of the days that make me so in our community members. We have a great mix of BIPOC community members, and that theme in farming is really important to us in terms of really bringing bringing color to the rural, because the rural is sometimes overly white, and it's really important. We had one of our members who go to school in our area, kids experiencing some pretty severe racism right in school. And so for us, we feel like, well, the more that we can bring color and diversity in the community and be with the community, because and with the community, the better things can be.
The farm's a catalyst to build an inclusive community.
Really and truly is.
That's pretty good.
Yeah. And so it's a strange thing, because as a sociologist, like, so in one way, it can feel like sometimes we're just in our own little micro world. Yes. And in one way we're like this 200 acres and growing this stuff and having people in and out. Like that's a whole world in itself. Like I don't need to look at the news sometimes doesn't make it into our brain.
If you need a tag, it could be an inclusive micro world.
Yeah, there you are. Inclusive micro world. But of course, it's super important that we're not really a micro world. Like that that we, because what can we, we don't want to be escaping the world.
No.
We don't want to be escaping just creating a nice subcultural space where we can, I don't know, get along with each other only, right? I think that's good stuff, but we want to be engaged in the world, like engaged in the issues of social, economic, and environmental justice. And you can't do that if we're only staying to ourselves,
No.
et cetera. But that's part of a whole way of building a community, right?
So
Valuing both things.
on that, Inclusive Economy London Network.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that.
So inclusive economy the project was called Inclusive Economy London and Region.
Yes.
This started about 2019 or 2018 in our work at the London Poverty Research Centre. It was funded by the Atkinson Foundation,
Okay.
which was out of Toronto. And Atkinson Foundation, it's one of the few funders who their tagline or their like sole focus almost is economic justice. It's like, yeah. So
That's cool.
So, oftentimes you get like maybe social or food security. This was just like, no, economic justice. How are we going to make the economy more fair?
Yeah.
Which is a really hard territory to work in. But, so Atkinson Foundation funded it to, build notions to really address those issues of the systemic issues of precarity in our society. So what we did was we looked, amazing support from organizations in London who have, again, mission alignment. We were able to at least start the conversations around what can be done in a city like London to create a more inclusive economy, to create an economy. This is the fun part. An economy which by design solves the problems that we're talking about, right? So like by design, rather than having to, the notion would be in an extractive economy, or we could refer to today sort of as in a capitalist economy, there's a lot of motivations to extract, to harm.
Yes.
Because it's pretty clear, like if I can take more out and get more for our industry or ourselves, than the ones who are harmed, hopefully we can just move on from. Yeah. And so there's a lot of work in the US and the Atkinson Foundation and different parts around what they're calling the community wealth building approach. Community wealth building. I think even in the UK, they've even got this community wealth building approach, which is about finding parts of the economy that are more mission aligned for the community and harnessing the economic power of those institutions. So take an example, a hospital, public institution, right? One of the largest employers in our region, maybe not, if not the largest employer in our region. A budget, in the billions to spend. And so you say, so there's a public institution with a mission, right, for health and creating more health. And so in this approach of Inclusive Economy London, or which can also be referred to in community wealth building, the idea is you pull together institutions that have these mission alignments, right? So a hospital, a university is also a public institution with a mission for developing citizens for the future, et cetera. University, hospital, the municipality is also an institution which has within its mission, the betterment of the community. So you take these public, semi-public institutions, bring them together, which also have some of the largest budgets in the entire region. Right? So they're spending huge dollars. And so one of the components of Inclusive Economy London was called the Anchor Collaborative. It was to bring these institutions together, look at the joint budgets. So like say, how many billions of dollars are we spending? And can we shift any of those dollars to support industries that are creating community benefit? Right. So you take, say, the food budget for a hospital, if we shift a small portion of that, how much industry can be developed that, promotes decent work, promotes food security, et cetera? Can we use those dollars to incentivize private sector activity, really? So that's one of the arms. There was a few different arms, but that was one of the more exciting ones.
So a lot of your work, how could a community member get involved in some of the initiatives that you've participated in or are participating in?
Well, I would say, like, so in the current situation, I am all in 100% on developing the New Moon Community Homestead, yes, and the sort of Rose Land Care Association, land trust kind of models. And so to get involved in that world, there's great ways. There's one, just from a farm support point of view. So as New Moon, we run a community. One of our main programs is the community homestead membership. So you can become a member of the farm, which can range from anything from just a financial contribution and being a member, being part of various activities that we do, to also receiving food weekly, and participating on the farm. So we have a community homestead membership, quite accessible, and that's a really great way to get involved. From there, just even so there's volunteerism opportunities on the farm, just to slowly get involved, bring skill sets, etc. And then there's also volunteerism with the Rose Land Care Association, this whole land holding side of things, and governance and all that sort of stuff.
Okay, we've talked about a lot of stuff. Is there anything that we missed? Anything you want to talk about?
Wow. No, we talked pretty much about the heart and soul.
We got to it.
Of what we were after. Or that's the world of you almost got all the whole world of thoughts I have.
Okay, I've only got one last question.
Yeah.
What keeps you growing?
The beauty of that land. I gotta say, like, because life gets real tough some days, but I've learned, rather than getting really frustrated or emotional, overreacting about it all, sometimes it's one thing about being in that rural area with this work is like just stopping and looking at the amazing things that are growing, or the river, or the sunrise in the morning. Mm-hmm. And the luck, I feel extremely blessed to even be there. Like, that's a privilege to even be in that land. That's one thing that really keeps me growing. I guess the other, how could you also have 4 children?
Yeah.
Like, 4 children, I've got a lot of motivation to keep growing, to be better and better for the family, and then also better and better for the community. In the community, I'm really strong, and for me is the importance of being recognizing my own flaws, being humble, and not allowing myself to be dragged down. Like, those are all important features for me about being a vibrant human. Yeah.
Cool. Okay. Where can people find out more about the work you're doing, specifically New Moon Community Homestead?
Yeah, I think the easiest place would be our website,
okay,
newmooncommunityhomestead.ca. You can also have, we're just coming to the end of our series that we've done called Farm Gate Fridays.
Yes.
So we're the second Friday of each month.
Okay.
We were hosting sort of on-farm markets, music, tours, etc.
Mike, thank you for everything you do to address some really challenging societal issues, and for being with us here today.
Well, thank you. My pleasure.
Growability is hosted by Joe Gansiflis and Holly Pugsley, and produced by Joe Gansiflis and Adam Kaplan. Special thanks to this week's guest, Dr. Mike Courey. Lighting and camera design by Kevin Labont, with production support from Oliver Gansiflis. Growability's production was made much easier with the help of Jesse Chen, Terry Fujioka, Zach Grossman, Zachary Meads, Leo Shin, and Deborah Camargo from Fanshawe College's Broadcasting, Television, and Film Production program. Thanks to Janice Robinson from Fanshawe for arranging for these students' invaluable participation. Holly Pugsley of Just Keep Growing provided the plants and made sure they looked great. Audience and marketing strategy by Japs Karmiglani with support from Dorantina Uka and Tess Alcock. Our theme music is Wandering William by Adrian Walter and can be found on Soundstripe. Thanks as well to Hubert Orlowski for providing technical and audio engineering advice to help our podcast sound great. Adam Kaplan, that's me, is Webisode's executive producer, and Sammy Orlowski is our senior creator. Special thanks to Jennifer Routley from Siskins the Law Firm for arranging to host us at their beautiful head office in downtown London, Ontario. Growability is a Webisodes production and is produced with the support and participation of the team at The Patch and Hutton House.